Thank you very much, Rosemary, for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for having me. And I have to say that this talk was very difficult for me to prepare, as I'm speaking here in a double role. I'm a Christian who cares deeply about the Christian message of love and peace in Europe and elsewhere. But I'm also a social scientist who explores the role of religion in European politics. And of course, even though I'm both at the same time, I was encouraged by the organizers to focus more on the scholarly side of my presentation, so that the responses then can come from perhaps a bit more theologically grounded perspective, which I think will hopefully work very well for our panel. So I'll mainly focus on the secular dimension of discussion about secularization and the reactions of European churches there too, from a sociological perspective, or from a perspective of sociology of religion. And I very much hope that the perspectives will complement one another, so please bear with me. I hope it will be of some use to you. So the starting point of my talk is the general process of secularization that has affected all European societies, albeit with different speeds. I should probably start by clarifying that secularization and secularism are loaded terms, which mean different things in different contexts. In some languages, secularization bears a rather negative connotation of suppressing religion, state actively suppressing religion, while in others it is more neutral, as it is related to the neutrality of the state in religious affairs and to the diversification of religious beliefs and practices and communities. And of course, from the point of view of a minority church, secularization might be even seen as a blessing, which, by the way, we discussed in the confessional group as well. So be it as it may, Europe is the continent where secularization has advanced the most. If we take the classic triplet of belonging, behaving, and believing, the three dimensions that are usually measured. So whether people self-identify with the church, whether they comply with some norms, and whether they believe in the basic tenets of a faith traditions, all the three indicators have been showing a steady and fast-paced decline all across Europe. Of course, again, a different speed in the West than the East, North, South, but the trend is the same. So trend number one, continued fast secularization across the board. Then we have trend number two, a parallel trend, a more recent one, and that is the trend, surprisingly, of a partial desecularization. Scholars have started talking about the resurgence of religion some 15 years ago in Europe, or more precisely about the return of religion to the public sphere. Now, this is clearly related to migration on the one hand, immigrant churches, but also other religious communities, new religious communities appearing in Europe. But second, and that is perhaps equally important, also via the increased visibility of religion in politics, and not only visibility, but presence. And that is a rather quick change that happened within the last 10 years. More or less, Christianity started to be much more frequently not only mentioned, but also invoked in political discourses, especially when talking about the traditional values, about Europe being defined by its Christian roots. But importantly, very often this talk is defensive in nature. So we refer to, or politicians refer to, Christianity as contrasted, or the Christian nature of Europe as contrasted to some external, supposedly hostile forces endangering the European way of life. So needless to say, this trend is more pronounced on among the far-right parties or Eurosceptic movements, but it is increasingly becoming mainstream. And again, there are studies that show really convincingly how the number of references to Christianity by political readers has been multiplying recently, which is strangely disconnected from the real decline or increase in the number of Christians, right? So that's trend number 2, a parallel process of a partial desecularization, or what you might call even a politicization of Christianity, especially in some segments of the political spectrum. And then finally, you have a third trend, or we have a third trend here as well, one that is much less visible, but sociologically not less important. And which is that there is an increasing number of people who self-identify as believers, whatever that means, but who do not belong to a particular religious institution, tradition, community, to a church. And mind you, I'm not talking about a marginal phenomenon somewhere in like thousands of people, but I'm talking about millions. Let me give you the example, very concrete example of the recent census that we had conducted, that was conducted last year in my country, the Czech Republic, in 2021. And the results were made public just a couple of days ago, or weeks ago. And on the one hand, on the surface, the secularization continues. So there is 100,000 fewer people identifying with a concrete church. So the church membership going down. But on the other hand, there is also an increase by 250,000, 250,000 in 10 years from the last census, of those who say they are believers without belonging to a church. So to sum up, today we have 40% of those who identify as believers outside a church in the Czech Republic. And you might argue that this is an outlier, that the Czech Republic is a special case, but it is not really. The trends are perhaps not as pronounced, but they are the same in most, especially Western and Northern European countries. So this is a broader European trend as well. Trend number 3, which is sometimes called unchurching, and a growing number of what you might call seekers. And the main argument I want to say, and I'm moving to the second part of my talk, is that interestingly, we can see 3 different approaches taken by the churches in reaction to these 3 trends. And I want to stress before talking about them that I'm talking about ideal types, right? So in practice, you will definitely always find a combination of 2 or even 3 of them, and the cases are not as clear-cut as I will present them. But this is for the sake of the cleanliness of the argument, and then we may talk about the empirical situation on the ground. So approach number 1, something that is typically titled strategy of closure, something that we have known very well from our Christian history, in reaction to the growing difference between what the church believes and what is happening in the society at large. There has always been a tendency to close itself off, to create a distance between ourselves and the society that is perceived as corrupt, sinful, or consumerist, is the newest incarnation of that argument. And again, sociologically, this is a strategy that is typical for the smaller, more radical groups. And but also this trend today is more pronounced with some confessional families than with others. Richard Niebuhr, the famous American theologian, called that position Christ against culture. So there is a deep stark difference between Christ and the secular culture. Niebuhr uses Tertullian as his historical example of this position: purity of heart, stark confrontation with the society. But let's not see that only in negative terms. That is not my intention to say that this is a wrong approach, a wrong position, because it also allows for raising the prophetic voice, right? When you become different from the society, then you are well positioned to criticize it. So you may argue that Pope Francis's critique of consumerism is an example of this prophetic critique. That is only possible when you distance yourself from the society, see the society as something different than us. But it also brings dangers with it: ghettoization, sectarianism, the conviction that we own the truth, etc. So approach number one. Approach number two aligns with the powerful. Some would argue that the renewed relevance of the Christian church and Christian culture for political leaders is a blessing for us Christians. Why not tap the influence that the proximity to power can offer? This is not my preferred approach, but we should acknowledge that this is an approach, again, that is gaining quite some traction across parts of Europe. So it is definitely not marginal, and it's an approach that has some appeal because it can help churches do some good things as well, right? When you ensure, for instance, stable financial support by the state, then you can use it for charity work, for example. And of course, I don't want to go into concrete countries where this is the dominant approach, but I want to repeat that this is something that we have recently seen growing in popularity in some parts of Europe as well. The risks are obvious. Again, the Constantinian temptation, the church as the servant of the powerful instead of serving the oppressed and the marginalized. That I think is clear. But again, I don't want to just denigrate that approach. There are some pluses and minuses related to it. And approach number three, which is related to the third trend, to the unchurching and the growing number of those who we might call the seekers. And I'd like to call this approach talking to Zacchaeus, which is not my idea. It's an argument used by a Czech theologian, Tomáš Halík, is the title of his book, Talking to Zacchaeus, the biblical tax collector. So the church welcoming not only those who enter the church, but seeking out those who observe the church from afar, who perhaps, like Zacchaeus, remain hidden in the branches of the tree, who are watching what the church is doing, perhaps being curious, wanting to find out more. The approach has clear advantages. Unlike the first, it does not risk becoming the church becoming an ever smaller flock. Unlike the second, it doesn't need to strike an alliance with the power that be. But this approach has its downsides as well. Let's be open about that. By going out to address the Zacchaeuses of today, the church, in a sense, weakens the protective institutional edifice it has so painstakingly built around itself, perhaps even risking that this protective shell will shatter entirely. So the question is, does the church not lose itself? Does it not lose its essence, what it means to be a church when it goes out to drink with tax collectors? I mean, metaphorical tax collectors, clearly. Now, these are all, by the way, I'm just filling out my text form, so it has more relevance than one would expect. But these are all critical questions that we need to ponder very, very seriously. And I'm sure the picture that I have presented here is incomplete, and perhaps you have already come up with other possible positions, other approaches that might correspond to what your own churches are doing more better than what I described. And I also think that you can guess where my sympathies lie, but I do realize that the picture is complex and there is no single answer, no single perfect solution. But the good news, at least for me, and I hope for all of us, is that there is a perfect guide for us, one who often remains hidden or silent, but one who will never abandon us. Thank you.